So just quick about us. Yeah, my name's Martin. I'm CTO for medudoc education. So we do patient education solutions for hospitals and clinics and stuff like that. Before that, I was the director of the platform program at Ada Health. So I've been working in healthcare tech for a while now.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Paul Oostenrijk. I'm CTO and co-founder of PBJ. We're in a product studio, product company located really in New York, but spread across the world. Before that, I was previously at Fueled in New York City and co-founded a couple of other companies such as SendCloud, not the SoundCloud, which I hoped. But yeah, happy to be presenting for you guys, and yeah, hopefully you find some value out of our presentation we prepared for you.
This was one that actually Rich came up with, which was I just thought was interesting because it's been one I've been thinking about a lot recently, and talked with Paul about it. And we had some conversations and thought to talk about it together on, especially because we've got some interesting overlaps in what we've done. I used to work in agency world. Paul works in agency world now and have moved much more into startups in the last 5 years. So, the interesting between them. And this is like when people say what is product, what is the thing, it's really even changed over the last 5 years or so. And it depends on who you ask, which company you ask, if you talk to a startup or you talk to a, agency. And Paul described it as doing a product agency. At Ada, product kind of encapsulated everything. It was technology was part of product, everything was part of product. And that was interesting because I felt like it put quite a focus on the kind of end result, or, if you're looking at it, kind of part of the product being really fixated on features and things like that. And we'll dig into this a bit later, but the terms like product owner and product manager and all of these are really variable. So when I was at agencies, product owner was usually someone from a client side. And
yeah.
That as I think that's the case with you, Paul.
Yeah, no, totally. Our product owners are usually the clients or a PM outside of at the company that we work with. They're usually the visionary. They know around
the users, I suppose.
Yeah, they're interested around their customers and what features they sense that from metrics and etc. What they see as valuable, and that's completely different to what we have. We also have product managers, and product managers to us is a completely other role and have clearly different incentives, which we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, I found that, product manager I've had that called project manager, delivery manager, business analyst, like all number of different things when I was working at agencies, and it's really variable.
Yeah, and it's only been like maybe 8-7 years since I've really sent, it's especially from the Netherlands, like from Europe overall, I didn't know about product engineering or product management before. Only in the US I started to get familiar with it, and so it's a pretty recent overall profession.
Product ownership especially. Yeah. And I found in startups, product owner it's more recently becoming its own role. People train to be product owners. And I found this a bit weird personally. And I found this quite weird because the product owners I've seen have tended to have this real fixation on features. I think this is a concept heavily with lots of startups where the founders are involved in, the first product people is also the founder. You get this founder trap thing where they get fixated on what the features are rather than the value that it's bringing to people. So this is something we'll get into. So kind of an fun analogy is that the product for me is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's kind of the end result. And it's this thing that a lot of people, it's the most visible part of actually a much bigger thing. Is this product, is like this tip of the iceberg, this end result actually the product, or, what are we talking about here? Like I said, at Ada, they actually use product to encapsulate everything. But I think when you call it product, it puts a lot of emphasis on just the end part of the equation. And, really there's also, the user facing app is the bit that people fixate on, but actually, part of product, or what was included in product at Ada, was also the back end, the infrastructure, the CI/CD systems. And then if you go further down into it, there's also, well, actually engineering practices and architecture and your org structure and what is the purpose of what you're building in the first place. And all of these things kind of mix together and into this big blob of things and concerns that you might have that all impact each other. So, technical debt, how does that work? How do you deal with that using engineering practices? How does your architecture impact different things? And with calling things product, or this lots of product owners, especially in startups, get fixated on this, just that top little bit of the iceberg, the end result. And I think this causes a lot of challenges, especially later on. We'll talk about this a bit more, but like talking about things like technical debt. So what is this whole thing? Like, what is actually this? What is all this stuff? What do you call that if not product? Like, because technology is really blended all through this. So what is the thing? And really, what I've been fixated on a lot recently is the concept of complexity of socio-technical systems. So like, what is like people in technology and how do they work together? How do we stop like hitting this iceberg and having this cause us problems? That was kind of the idea. Yeah, socio-technical systems. So really, it's just people in technology and how do they work together to add value. And really, the ultimate idea is about providing valuable outcomes to people and not really product. So I've tended away from even talking about product that much in startups. I think it makes sense if you're a product agency more, but in startups, I've tended to talking about, rather than minimum viable products, I talk about minimum viable solution, or even like, minimum valuable solution, because not everything you're going to produce is necessarily even about providing value, of being viable. It's about providing value sometimes, and value for what. So valuable could also include like testing hypotheses around things, because one of the big things I found when you're starting up a new product or trying to develop it is you've got all these built-in assumptions that you have not necessarily validated. And sometimes what you want to create a solution for, or some kind of solution, is to actually just validate those assumptions. Like, does this work in this market? Is there actually a market fit here? How do we solve this particular problem? And sometimes you will build a prototype that is just to solve that, and you're going to throw it away because you're really aiming is to answer some question that you've proposed, or validate an assumption that you may already have. And so what you ultimately are trying to create is a socio-technical system that can do that, rather than fixating on creating features, which when you talk a lot about product, people get caught up in this idea of that you have to produce a product, and the minimum viable product being like this ultimate like end result.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it really applies the social technical like systems that you're trying to create is very much, I think, encapsulates a lot the responsibility of a CTO, or in many ways a lot of the C-level suite, right? Of making sure that instead of trying to create the features, you're trying to create a culture where the feature can be built as fast and as reliable as good as possible. And with that, you have obviously different processes that you could apply. You can decide for an agile development, or you can decide for a waterfall development. And I think, Martin, you had a point here, right? You wanted to hone in.
Yeah, I think, again, on the product versus technology thing, like, I think lots of people see, or lots of product owners I've seen in a few different companies, see that the technology part is the development bit. It's the code you write. Whereas actually technology really hits all of these aspects, like how, like, it's also included in your CI/CD system. How do you track and monitor like the requirements that you're doing? How do you know that what you've built is, like, how do you validate the assumptions or the hypotheses that you had at the beginning if you haven't built that into the requirements at the start and have a way of monitoring and tracking that? So technology really it sits across all these aspects. Good.
And affects the whole process as well. So in our agency, what we're trying to usually do is obviously optimize our process as well. And later on, I would even point out that what we're selling as an agency is the process. And so to us, like all these points of the agile development is really like technology is, you know, breathing through that completely. As if we make sure that we assign that involve technology in all those steps, we are able to, first of all, create better products, but also have better estimations, have better idea around the efforts being taken. Everything overall in these processes can must have the technology in mind, so that way, you know, the process overall can be more effective as you are able to detect, you know, potential technicalities that are impossible. And you know, instead of having designers and product designers and product managers imagine all this you know, beautiful ideas, to then make sure that, you know, we can do them in the first place without spending so much time you know, figuring out on how to fix a problem with technology.
And including all of the aspects of the socio-technical system that you're developing in your roadmap. I think this happens quite a lot, that often you'll have things not included in the roadmap because they're not a feature, right? Or they're ignored, and then they're not estimated. So for example, you know, how do we monitor this thing? How do we make sure that we actually can track this? You know, and including that, making sure that's included in the requirements, making sure the build pipeline is included in the requirements, and have these as part of your roadmap, which I often seen ignored by product owners because, again, they're fixated or focused on like just that product, that top tip of product. Yeah, again, this is what I was saying. Like, I think, you know, reframing the way in which we talk about it and potentially talking less about product, at least for, you know, in startups, and talking more about value and the whole system, and looking at the whole system, and having the product, you know, maybe not even necessarily having product owners, especially for startups, focusing more on having user researchers as part of the team. I've seen, this is what we have. We don't have a product owner, we have a user researcher. You know, we don't need anyone to own product because this is a collaborative, for us, it's a collaborative thing, and having much more focus on what are our assumptions that we're making, how do we validate those, what do we need to do that, you know, what are all the requirements from the user, make sure we know those, and what do we need, what's all the aspects of the socio-technical system that we need to build to ensure that we can provide value to the customers, rather, or to our users, rather than figuring out what features we need to build, because ultimately, yeah, it's not my job. We'll get into that again. So
yeah, so at least so for at PBJ, we work in project teams that usually work on client projects, which is pretty obvious for an agency. But I think in some way, and I think is it maybe Paul on this call actually mentioned it before around speedboats and some sort of boating. I saw something around it last meetup that you guys did, digital meetup. Is I think that is kind of where I'm also touching at, is that because we are in an agency style and we have these clients coming in with different ideas, different products, we're really able to segment the work into specific groups. And I think that kind of essential like efficiency is really helpful also for example, just product companies to take on. Although it's harder to define, you usually have a very integrated system where there's multiple facets. It will still be good, I think, if you're able to segment your team into smaller teams, as I think personally, I've always experienced that it really improves the effectivity of the team. And what I mean by that is that if you build specific roles for product ownership, is it user research or is it product ownership as in the team, it really helps with you know, creating the separation of incentives. As you know, as a product owner, you're really interested in what your customer success looks like. As a product manager, you're really interested into you know, thinking about the user, but also thinking about what the roadmap looks like, what the priorities look like, how they match up. and how that technically could potentially work out. I think with that, as product owners are usually the client, there is for us as an agency, it really helps making sure that the development team isn't. I really value that engineering teams can completely focus on their job and do the best job possible. And with that, it means that there needs to be an overall focus around what functionality you're working on, or simply just not having to be distracted all the time. And so I think making sure that you have a product owner and a product manager really creates that separation and makes it possible for a very effective and faster development speed than if you would just have a product owner and a product manager altogether. It doesn't really mean that one person cannot be a product owner or product manager at once, but it definitely means that if it would be one person, they would definitely have to make sure that there are two different mindsets to it. Exactly. And that can be very hard.
I've actually never seen it work. Like, you always have a lean towards one thing. Like, because when I was being a product owner for technical stuff, because I was technical, I always ended up putting a technical slant on everything. And the business-minded POs or product managers, whatever they were, also were always like business-minded, or the ones who had been user researchers were more focused on that. And it kind of the dichotomy of having two people, all those different roles.
And so I think even though maybe there are some people here that just have like product companies and are running big teams, I think I would advise still to figure out a certain structure like that where it can be an internal customer, right? It can still be an internal product owner. But it's very interesting how the communication changes whenever you separate that out into somebody that is really caring about the customer values and wants to achieve the best features possible, meaning the product manager, and then teams separate from that as they are able to really focus on the roadmap and being able to really effectively see the over holistic product that needs to be the end result. So that's something that I really honed down and we've really experienced with separating this out to increase the team effectivity by changing the team structures.
Yeah, I mean, similarly for us, we have a user researcher and a delivery manager. Like they're kind of different names, but the same thing. One person, I'm doing the delivery manager role, even though I'm CTO, I wear that hat, and we have a user researcher in the team as well. So you can also have engineers could hold the delivery manager hat, or even a user researcher hat. Like the role can be whoever, if that makes sense. Like just having someone to hold that or fight for that position is really interesting.
Yeah. So
we kind of talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if anyone would disagree, and I'd love to have a discussion later, but I think overall product development is inherently messy. It's a very maze of potentials of how can we find product market fit. It's very difficult. There are a lot of pivots involved, and it's just that it's very hard to just get to a product and be perfect. And
building teams is hard, basically.
Yeah.
The interesting part that you talked about before, I think you mentioned it, was that that's the value that agencies provide. Really, an agency's product is not actually the product that you build for a client. The agency's product is actually the socio-technical system that you build. That is, you've built a system that can provide value, like basically a value pipeline very effectively, that you can drop into any domain and then provide value for a client. And the focus, I think, for agencies, and when I was an agency, the focus is much more on building this effective socio-technical system that can interact with clients, because clients are difficult. And you would think that it'll be easier when you're in a startup, but I've actually found the opposite, that the socio-technical systems in agencies are often much more lean and effective and ruthless, because they're forced to be, and sometimes
Yeah, and that's kind of also how it's set up, right? And that's what I was trying to say in a previous post or slide is it's really around like if you there is something around separating out the responsibilities of ownership and management of the product as they are completely different. It's not completely different. There definitely overlaps, but it's a different incentive. And I actually think overall an agency has lots of benefit of being an outsider. And I think a lot of clients that we work with also have the tendency to really like that because they usually are stuck on the small feature or some like specific.
They get caught up in the product part, in that product tip of the iceberg, because that's where most clients' heads are. That's often, and I've seen in lots of startups, that's where the product people's heads are as well.
And I wouldn't say like just go and hire always agencies. I'm not trying to sell myself, but I think having in some way a similar strategy with a product company where you separate that out, it can actually lead to better efficiencies.
Which is why I was saying hire more user researchers, because I think in startups are the voice of the user, and sometimes product owners actually end up not being the voice of the user. I've seen that a lot. They end up being the voice of the business or the voice of themselves, or in my case, when I was technical, the voice of engineering, because you've got all these concerns. So I think having lots of roles that do that. I'm writing code. I think, Paul, you said you were doing code as well. Still doing architecture stuff, and I am doing engineering practices, but really these aren't the role. I don't think the role of the CTO. You may do it, but it's not really the job, so to speak. The job, as I see it, is really to ensure that the socio-technical system that you're building collectively is effective at delivering value. So, how does Jira work with how does your product management tooling work? How does that integrate with your code repositories? How does this impact the developers? It's like all the technology that you use, and everything we do is based on technology. It's like, how does your Zoom connect with things to enable people to work better, especially in a remote world? It gets even more crazy to ensure that. It's like, how do all these different complex aspects of your socio-technical system impact each of each other? And which levers should you be pulling? Because I think you see a lot, I've seen this a lot with smaller companies. The CTOs will be like, yeah, we're doing engineering like this. And it's like dictating how engineering is done from the top. And ultimately that's much less effective. You create bottlenecks, and you're not the ones writing code. You're not the ones who have to deal with that. You're not the ones who have to manage with the engineering practices. And really your only care should be, is what I'm doing enabling the teams to provide value to whoever, whatever that value is, and then tweaking and ensuring the socio-technical system that you're building is effective at doing that using technology and people. So it could be reorging the company to enable certain different practices. Like, how do you reorg to enable 24/7? Like, how do you handle 99.99% uptime? What are you going to do to deal with that? How does those things, and understanding how those things could work at a high level. Kind of flip the thing around and start with purpose at the top. What is the purpose? What is all this complex system in the middle? And how do we build it so that it can just pump out value and really provide valuable solutions, whatever they are, be it solution to solve a hypothesis or a solution that gives me more information to move forward, or a solution that provides value to the end customer, depending on what stage of the startup you're in, rather than getting caught up in the technology or the features that you're producing. And all these are reasons why I don't really talk about product anymore. I talk mostly about purpose, quality, value, solutions, whatever, because a product is just an end result, and it's actually less interesting than the value that you're actually creating. So it's just an inversion that's been going in my head a little bit recently. And how do we do this inversion, and how do we stop people getting too caught up in the end results, and more what is the focusing on the solution and focusing on the value, and focusing on the problem rather than focusing on features. which
Next.
often causes problems. So next one. Yeah, how do you do that? I've talked about different qualities that you could care about, like, and making sure they're all on the table. So like could include things like service level indicators, like your four golden signals, like error rate, all of those could be areas that you care about. Could also include like your usability and things like that, accessibility, any quality you care about, depending on what your purpose is. And technical debt is one indicator of this that you can look at. How do you measure it? How do you track it? How do you make sure that it's not impacting your product?
Yeah, so I think this is our last one, and I just wanted to, from my experience, talk a little bit about technical debt and how that relates to product and development. I think, and probably some of you would agree with me, is that bad product management or bad product team or just overall a team like effectivity or the team structure can really massively create technical debt. I would argue that a lot of just the company overall or strategies or standards really incur to technical debt. I would say that bad product management could be around incomplete tasks, not making sure that you have acceptance criteria involved. Having the whole idea of about move fast and breaking things, which sounds amazing for a product manager, but to me, it sounds like a little bit of a nightmare as an engineer. I think the product management and just overall having to deal with product influences a lot the engineering intent. I think overall the bigger chunk of the developers that I know, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but I think the bigger chunk is really wants to create the best systems. So I think overall inherently a lot of the people that become developers are in some way purists, and they try to always be, finding the best way possible, the best solution. Has some downsides, of course. We all know that, but I think having bad product management or in some way a bad product process of creating a process of finding the features that you want to create can really create this idea around engineering to just getting features done. So just applying new functionality on top of it. Yeah, it's just like a bigger mud. It's not an iceberg, I guess. Just bigger mud, and
Mudberg.
You just attach more mud to it. And I think it's always easier for an engineer, I think, to just create new features and not really think, and instead thinking of how can I have this current development code base, and how can I increase or improve the functionality to be more flexible. For example, the features have to come to multiple places. Are we going to reuse elements, or are we actually going to create new? Usually if I see if there's not a lot of product management involved, I usually see that is more of the case, where people are just like constantly just creating new feature functionality, simply creating new components, and even though there's one right next to it that would be able to do it by simply a little bit of tweaking.
Putting all the different qualities you care about on the table, like technical ones, design ones, accessibility ones, because you could have design debt. Like in a product that's long living, you could have, your onboarding flow sucks, or your app isn't properly accessible. Those are all forms of debt as well. And really knowing the qualities that you need to care about, different quality domains, different quality areas you need to care about, then having indicators for those. How do we measure how we're performing? What's the health of the product and or the solution we're providing in those areas? And then what is our objective there? What are we actually trying to hit? Like, how accessible does it need to be? How reusable and how sustainable do we want our code base to be? How tested does it even need to be? How much does that actually matter? And then having those agreed upon so that designers can care about the same things and everyone can have a centralized thing. They can all talk together rather than being only concerned about their little area of the world.
I want to thank everyone for listening to us and want to open up to questions.
So I have a question. So yeah, I'm Alexei. I'm head of engineering at Dental. So we're doing insurance business connected with dental services.
Okay.
Yeah, so my question is, what's the percentage of the time are you ready to pay for the technical debt for together with feature development?
It's a great question.
So basically, because it's very, how to say, different for each company.
Yeah.
Maybe together with your experience, you already got some magic formula, which kind of keeps your team happy.
Pareto principle, 80-20. No, I don't have, I absolutely have no metric whatsoever. What I think, what I really try to do is make sure that technical debt and a refactor is kind of a feature rather than seeing it as a, oh, we have to do it. We at PBJ, we have every 2 weeks of sprint planning, and in that we always happen to make sure that the refactor is also seen as an interest into the product rather than being like, oh, let's just create new features, because I think it's very enticing, right, to just say, let's just continue with feature development because it it helps our customers and it will help us get the revenue. I think it's really important in some way to create this idea around the flywheel effect of development, where the flywheel effect is better when there's less technical debt. And what I try to do, at least with the teams, is having regular check-ins around this conversation of approaching technical debt, and having conversations with the product team in order to make sure that they understand what the value is of such refactor or such change into code base.
The client as well is important. This is one thing we did when I was more in agency side, is we actually, included to the client, like, okay, we can do this feature, but that's at the cost of XYZ. So, it will have an impact on this. You won't get that, or, the code will become more, we can't clean up. There will be more bugs. Do you buy into that? Like, and having them understand, it's a bit about education is what we found, is we had to educate clients when it was dealing with clients. If it's with a company, it's slightly, if it's your own internal, then it's also education. It's educating product owners and your exec team as well about caring about the whole of the socio-technical system and what that means, and kind of moving them away from focusing just on that iceberg, the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I have seen organizations, and that's why I think it's a great question. I think it is almost and unable to answer it in some way. I don't know your situation, and I'm sure it was insurance, right, for dentistry. I'm sure there are old system in place, and I'm sure there's like all these very, very complicated situations that you're getting yourself into.
At Ada before, we basically did a projection of like how much it would slow down the development team and what the impact on cost would be over time of a projection. So like, we think this will, like, what's our cycle time? Okay, we have noticed that this may have X amount of impact on cycle time. How much does a delivery team cost over a cycle? And therefore, what is the projected cost impact over X amount of time of not fixing this debt? And, we did that a little bit, but nowhere near as much as we should have. But you can do that. We did those projections for big architectural changes, but you can really do it constantly for smaller ones. But you need the metrics and the ability to really observe that effectively to do that, which requires kind of thinking about what are those quality metrics that you're observing at the beginning to really measure the efficacy of your socio-technical system from the start, so that you can make those projections. Because if you don't, it's really hard to actually look at the impact of anything, of any debt you have, be it design or technical or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for answering.
Interesting topic. I've often actually found as a CTO role, collaborating with the product people to actually challenge the engineers, because I mean, if you have a larger team and you're not looking at a lot of the code all the time, you'll often find that there are vanity projects hidden under the technical debt. There's some super cool new library which I'd love to play with, and actually this challenging engineer, what does this do? What value does this bring? How does this change the life of the customer or our ability to service the customer better?
Exactly.
And if you don't have that strong relationship with the product owner, manager, whichever, then they don't know what to do. The engineers say this, and I read the technical debt's bad and we need to deal with it. So having this kind of relationship's really important.
I like this slide about that the CTO shouldn't be in the role of engineering, doing the engineering stuff. But I should admit that I've seen that before. So I've seen a CTO on a higher level, and he's responsible for over 50 resources, and still he's digging in the code and doing some coding stuff, and I was totally surprised. So that's a real case that I've seen it before, honestly.
Yeah, and I would confess that it's probably, you know, has a lot to just do by size and just, you know, monetary, right? We're very small. I'm still in many code bases, not as deep as the full-time engineers that are completely on the project, but still in some way, I think it's good. And to touch on that, it's like that friction between the development team and product is actually, it's not a bad thing at all. I think it is a love-hate relationship that you know is happens a lot. You know, product is really focused on that idea of value and business value and you know, business value versus effort. And then there's the development team, which is like, ooh, what new technology thing I could create, or what is this novel idea that I could potentially implement in this situation.
So Paul, that's what I like effectively. So the more you interfere, the CTO interfere with the job, the less innovation the team will have. And that's a very important aspect to consider, that when you hire interesting and smart people, just, you know, let them do the job and take care about the strategic objectives and strategic planning, and do your job as well. So that's a clear message, I think, to every CTO. Well,
I also do think, to Paul's point, for a CTO, it's also good sometimes to understand also what's going on and not get too out of touch, because, you know, I fell into that trap where I was very out of touch with certain things because I got so far out of the code base, and I actually not lost touch of what the code was, but actually lost touch of what the engineers felt about it, how people emotionally felt about parts of the code base, all the things that I was talking about strategically having an impact on. And that's because I wasn't in there seeing it so much. So one thing that I felt is, you need to, if you're not in there, you need to have very strong relationships with certain people who are. And then when you get to another, like I was even 2 tiers out of that, but the person that I was trying to get in touch with also was getting further out of the code base. So they need people who are in the code base who can relay that information back up, because strategic changes can really emotionally impact people. And that's part of the socio-technical system. Like, if you change something that people care about in a way that you didn't bring them on for the ride, they're going to hate you for it. And that makes further change hard. And that makes impacting things positively hard. And you can really break a company, and you can break engineers by not understanding the emotional impact of technical changes on the socio-technical system that you have. That's why it's like, that's why it's fascinating. And that's what I see as the CTO's job. So being in the code and understanding the intricacies in there, you still need to have those fingers in there somehow, even if they're not your fingers, at least.
It's a kind of like you know, with a car, you just kind of need like that oil test, right? You want to in some way be able to really and make sense of a black box that is development.
You may have answered it then. I think Paul hopped in again. You touched on it there. I know you mentioned, Martin, during your talk about the distinction between product owner and project manager, product management, sorry. Would you, at C-level, so we're talking at CPO, CTO, again, putting it out to the floor here, because I know we've got CTOs and CPOs in here. Should there be a clear distinction from a business case of, right, we're going to separate these two? Because I see a lot of, obviously, people within our network that are CTPOs, or again, you're talking about they're doing everything. Should they have a...
Superman.
That's what, yeah. So should there be a clear distinction between a chief product officer and a CTO, or again, is it business size?
It's Paul's point. It's Paul's point that he made before. It's about this dichotomy between those two things and having that friction, and that's really valuable. Having it all under one person will end up being under their slant. Maybe you can jump in, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's possible, and I don't, anyone that is CTPO superhuman can do anything. I have much of respect, but I think it is a very big and hard exercise. I think, again, I heard like, we have this new library that we could choose, right? And use in this project. That is maybe not the case with a CTO, because they're a little bit more aware around the intricacies of just like taking a new thing and just applying it to your product while not really realizing the technical depth. It's that, if you mix those two mindsets, it's going to be difficult for you to see what the priority is for the user rather than for what you think is important to you. And that's also what I'm saying. Like a lot of technology people, I think developer engineers or what level you are, you're in some way a purist. You'd like to have things go well, perfect and system like perfectly oiled down. And I think in many ways that's the product, product development is inherently messy. Is my point there is that a product manager, overall, the people that I work with are usually all over the place. They have different ideas, they have different features, they have different market researches in order to grasp an opinion. As a CTO, that's going to be really difficult because you're also having this idea that you want to have it perfectly and perfectly pure, and that's never really going to be the case. You're always going to have some technical depth because in some way you want to be faster than the market, and if you're not faster in the market, you're not going to survive. So there's this urge and this friction, which I think is very healthy. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but you do have to definitely have to put different hats on all the time in order to make sure that's hard.
Yeah, I think the interesting one is the product CPO could potentially, if you want to look at how they could work together, as the CPO is more looking at the external world and the things that are kind of outwards coming in, and like the users, who are the people, what are the things, what does the market look like, what are all those criteria, and then the CTO is really looking at the internal socio-technical system and how can you then translate all that incoming information and output value, and how is your internal systems, your internal culture, your internal structures, your internal processes and practices and technology that impacts that, enabling you to take that incoming information that the CPO is distilling and ensure that it can be filtered out to produce value out the other side. And those two roles can work effectively like that, but you could do them at the same time. Like,
yeah, hats off.
Yeah. Trying to be those two things at the same time right now is very hard. I'm trying to do both, and it's too much content.
Awesome.